My name is Naomi, and at 34 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing here packing the last cardboard box from what used to be my marital home. Marcus, my husband of 5 years, just served me divorce papers yesterday, claiming I was nothing but a financial burden dragging down his success. The prenup he insisted I sign to protect his precious assets sits on the kitchen counter right next to the house keys I'm supposed to leave behind. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known you better. 7 years ago, I met Marcus at a charity gala for children's literacy. I was there as a volunteer, helping coordinate the silent auction, wearing a simple black dress I'd bought 3 years earlier from a department store sale. Marcus was there as a donor, his custom Italian suit catching the light as he outbid everyone for a weekend yacht package he'd never use. When he approached me during the dessert service, I was balancing 3 plates while trying to help an elderly donor find her table. He said my genuine smile was the first real thing he'd seen all evening. The pursuit that followed was like something from those romance movies I used to watch with my grandmother. Flowers arrived at my workplace every Monday for 3 months straight. Not just any flowers, but exotic orchids and roses that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My coworkers at the office would gather around my desk, amazed at the elaborate arrangements. Marcus would show up for lunch, taking me to restaurants where the menus didn't have prices and the waiters knew his name. Weekend getaways to vineyards in Napa. Private jet rides to Miami just for dinner. I kept telling him it was too much that I was happy with Chinese takeout and Netflix. He'd laugh and say my simplicity was refreshing. I hesitated about the wealth gap between us for months. My 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, which I shared with a roommate, could fit inside his penthouse bathroom. I took the subway to work while he had a driver. My idea of splurging was buying the organic eggs at the grocery store. His was dropping $50,000 on a watch. But Marcus was persistent, charming, and seemed genuinely fascinated by what he called my authentic way of living. He said women usually dated him for his money, but I was different. I actually tried to pay for my own coffee. The night he proposed, he took me to the observation deck of the Empire State Building after hours. Just us, a string quartet, and the entire city glittering below. The ring was a family heirloom, his grandmother's, he said. Not some gaudy diamond from Tiffany's, but a vintage piece with history and meaning. I cried when I said yes, not because of the grandeur, but because he'd chosen something with sentiment over price. He promised that money would never matter between us, that love was our only currency. Our wedding was modest by his standards, elaborate by mine. I insisted on a small ceremony in Central Park with only 50 guests instead of the 500-person spectacle his mother wanted at the plaza. I wore my grandmother's altered wedding dress instead of the designer gown his personal shopper selected. Marcus seemed charmed by it all, telling his friends how refreshing it was to marry a woman who cared about meaning over materialism. His friends' wives, dripping in diamonds, would look at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. After the wedding, I moved into his penthouse on the Upper East Side. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble everything, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I felt like an imposter those first few months, afraid to touch anything cooking in one corner of the vast kitchen. Marcus would come home to find me reading on the small balcony instead of in the massive living room. He thought it was adorable. I was just overwhelmed. Despite his protests, I kept my admin job at the office downtown. Marcus couldn't understand why I'd want to work when I didn't have to. His money was our money now, he said. But that job meant something to me. It was mine, something I'd earned, something that existed before him. Every morning I'd kiss him goodbye as he left for his corporate headquarters, then I'd take the bus to my own workplace. He thought I was being proudly independent. The truth was more complicated than that. At his corporate events, Marcus would introduce me as his sweet, simple wife. The word simple started to appear more and more. Simple Naomi who shops at Target. Simple Naomi who clips coupons despite being married to a millionaire. Simple Naomi who doesn't understand the stock market conversations at dinner parties. His business associates' wives would try to include me in their conversations about their latest spa treatments in Switzerland or their children's equestrian competitions, but I'd have nothing to contribute. I'd smile and nod, feeling smaller with each passing month. Marcus took control of our finances from day one. It made sense, he said. He had the expertise, the connections, the understanding of how money worked. He gave me a credit card for household expenses and personal shopping, with what he considered a generous monthly limit. $5,000 seemed like an absurd amount to spend on myself, so I rarely used even a fraction of it. He'd check the statements and tease me about being the only woman in Manhattan who couldn't max out a credit card. My daily routine became a careful performance of the life Marcus expected while maintaining the one I actually lived. I'd leave the penthouse each morning taking the bus to my job that Marcus believed was just filing papers and answering phones. I'd eat lunch from my packed container while my coworkers went out. After work, I'd stop at the regular grocery store, not the organic luxury market Marcus preferred buying ingredients for dinner with cash I'd saved. I cooked every night elaborate meals from recipes my grandmother taught me, and Marcus would praise my domestic skills while suggesting we really should hire a chef. The small signs were there from the beginning, but love has a way of making you colorblind to red flags. He'd buy me clothes without asking, designer pieces that hung in the closet with tags still on, while I wore my comfortable department store finds. He'd correct my grammar at parties, even though I have a college degree. He'd laugh off my opinions about his business deals as cute, rather than considering them seriously. His friends started calling me the lucky one who hit the jackpot by landing Marcus. My grandmother Margaret, who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 4, was the only family I had left. She lived in a modest senior community in Jersey, refusing Marcus's offers to move her somewhere more upscale. She said she liked her small apartment, her weekly bingo games, her garden plot in the community yard. When Marcus met her, he was polite but distant, checking his phone constantly during our visits. She'd watch him with sharp eyes, saying nothing but seeing everything. Marcus's business was expanding rapidly during our first 2 years of marriage. Tech ventures, real estate developments, international partnerships. He'd come home excited about deals worth millions using terms I supposedly wouldn't understand. He never noticed that I'd ask specific questions that helped him think through problems. He assumed my questions came from ignorance rather than insight. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. His social circle consisted of other wealthy couples who lived in the same bubble of privilege. The men would cluster together talking business, while the wives discussed their latest cosmetic procedures and vacation homes. I became expert at deflecting personal questions about my background, keeping things vague. Orphaned young, raised by grandmother, worked hard, met Marcus. That was my story, and I stuck to it. No one pressed for details, because frankly, no one really cared about the simple wife who didn't contribute to their world's currency of wealth and status. The changes in Marcus started slowly, like a tide coming in, so gradually you don't notice until you're already wet. Comments about my appearance became more frequent and less kind. He'd suggest I get highlights because my natural brown hair was mousy. He'd buy me designer clothes without asking, then look disappointed when I wore my usual comfortable outfits. When I'd dress up for his events, he'd always find something to adjust, like a parent preparing a child for school photos. His new business partner, Brittany, entered our lives like a hurricane dressed in Prada. Blonde Harvard MBA daughter of an investment firm mogul, she was everything I wasn't on paper. She spoke the language of leveraged buyouts and market volatility fluently. Her clothes were always perfectly tailored, her nails never chipped her laugh timed to perfection. Marcus introduced her as the future of their company's expansion into international markets. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about her should have been my first real warning. Late nights at the office became Marcus's new routine. He'd text that he was in important meetings, that Brittany had arranged critical conference calls with Tokyo or London. I'd fall asleep alone in our king-sized bed, waking up to find him gone already, or sometimes not home at all. Weekends started disappearing, too consumed by business trips that apparently required just him and Brittany to close deals. He'd return energized, full of stories about successful negotiations, while I spent those weekends with my grandmother or reading in the park. It was during one of those solitary weekends that my grandmother called me, her voice shaky in a way that made my stomach drop. She'd been feeling weak, dizzy spells that she'd hidden during my recent visits. The doctors found a mass in her chest pressing against her heart. Surgery was required. Expensive surgery that her Medicare would only partially cover. She tried to refuse treatment, saying she'd lived a good life, but I wouldn't hear it. This woman who raised me, who worked 3 jobs to put me through college, who taught me everything about strength and dignity, deserved every chance. I started pulling from my personal savings money I'd accumulated before Marcus from years of careful budgeting. I didn't tell Marcus about the medical bills. He'd already made comments about my grandmother being a burden, how we were enabling her pride by not forcing her into better care. I knew he'd write a check without blinking, but it would come with strings, with judgment, with the kind of charity that diminishes the receiver. So I handled it myself, taking time off work to be with her during treatments, sitting in waiting rooms that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The day before her surgery, my grandmother grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with purpose, locked onto mine. She tried to tell me something important, something about papers, about truth, about being more than anyone knew. The medications made her words jumbled, but she pressed a small brass key into my palm, making me promise to remember when the time was right. She mentioned a safety deposit box at a bank I'd never heard of, mumbling numbers that I quickly wrote down. I thought it was the drugs talking, the fear of mortality making her confused. Marcus's irritation about my devotion to my grandmother grew with each passing day. He called it drama, unnecessary disruption to our lives. When I missed his company's Christmas party to stay with her during a particularly bad night, he was furious. That was the night Brittany wore a red designer dress that photographed beautifully next to Marcus in all the society pages. They looked like a match set, both golden and gleaming, while I sat in a hospital room holding a basin for my grandmother. The social humiliations accumulated like paper cuts, each one small but collectively bleeding me dry. At the spring gala for Marcus's company, Brittany commanded the room in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. Marcus introduced her to everyone as his brilliant partner, his hand on her lower back as he guided her through the crowd. When someone asked about me, his actual wife, he'd say I was somewhere around, probably hiding in a corner with a book. The laughter that followed felt like ice in my veins. His colleagues' wives tried to include me in their conversations, but the divide was becoming unbridgeable. They discussed their investment portfolios while I stayed silent. They compared notes on their children's private school admissions while I had nothing to contribute. They planned shopping trips to Paris while I calculated whether I could afford my grandmother's next medication copay. One particularly awful evening, I overheard Brittany tell Marcus that he could do better, that a man of his caliber deserved a partner who could match his ambition. Marcus didn't defend me. His silence was louder than any agreement could have been. The night I confronted him about Brittany, he turned it around on me. I was being jealous, insecure, paranoid. Brittany was just a business partner who understood his world in ways I never could. If I felt inadequate, maybe I should do something about it instead of trying to drag him down. Why didn't I take some classes, learn about finance, make myself useful? The man who once said he loved my simplicity now wielded it like a weapon against me. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, never liked me, but she became openly hostile as Brittany's presence grew. She'd call during dinners knowing I was cooking, insisting Marcus needed to discuss urgent family business. She'd drop by when she knew I was alone, making cutting remarks about the apartment's decor, about my cooking, about my obvious inability to give her grandchildren. During one particularly vicious visit, she said Marcus was just going through a phase with me, that men like him always return to their own kind eventually. The weekend business trips increased to twice a month, then every week. Marcus wouldn't even pretend to be apologetic anymore. These deals were crucial, he said. Brittany had connections that could transform their company from national to global. I started finding receipts in his jacket pockets, expensive dinners for 2 charges from hotels during times he was supposedly in meetings. When I asked about them, he said they were client entertainment, that I wouldn't understand the complexities of business relationship building. My friend Jennifer, a nurse who'd known me since college, watched my marriage deteriorating with growing concern. She'd invite me for coffee, trying to get me to open up about what was happening. But how could I explain that I was living a double life, that the marriage everyone envied was actually a slow-motion catastrophe? How could I tell her that my husband was probably having an affair with his business partner, while I spent my savings on my grandmother's medical care? So I smiled and deflected, becoming an expert at pretending everything was perfectly fine. The discovery phase of Marcus's betrayal came in pieces like a horrible jigsaw puzzle I didn't want to complete, but couldn't stop assembling. It started with a receipt that fell from his gym bag, a charge from Cartier for a diamond bracelet that I'd never seen. The date matched our anniversary, but I'd received a generic bouquet of roses that looked like they came from the grocery store checkout line. When I checked our joint credit card statements online, something Marcus never thought I'd do, I found more purchases. Jewelry designer handbags, charges from La Bernardin and Daniel, during evenings when I was supposedly at my book club. The book club had become my cover story for the nights I spent at the hospital with my grandmother. Marcus never questioned it, probably relieved I had something to occupy my time. But according to these credit card records, he'd been having romantic dinners for two during every single one of my absences. The bottles of wine alone cost more than $800. The pattern was clear and devastating. While I sat in uncomfortable hospital chairs holding my grandmother's hand through chemotherapy treatments, my husband was courting another woman with our money. Brittany's Instagram account became my obsession. I created a fake profile to follow her, watching the story of my marriage's destruction unfold in filtered squares. There she was in Miami the same weekend Marcus had that urgent conference, her bikini photos carefully cropped, but Marcus's watch visible on a table in the background. There she was at a vineyard in Napa, holding a glass of wine with her left hand, where a new diamond bracelet caught the light. The bracelet from that Cartier receipt. She even posted photos from restaurants during the exact times Marcus was supposedly in late meetings, her captions coy and suggesting she was with someone special who had to remain anonymous. The text messages were the final nail in the coffin of my denial. Marcus had left his iPad on the kitchen counter one morning and his messages were synced. I wasn't snooping, just trying to move it to charge when notifications popped up. Messages from Brittany that left nothing to imagination. Plans for their future together once he handled his current situation. His situation. That's what I'd become. Not his wife, not his partner, but a situation to be handled. I tried one last time to save our marriage, approaching Marcus on a Sunday morning when he seemed relaxed. I suggested we needed to talk about the distance growing between us. His immediate defensiveness told me everything. He launched into a tirade about my lack of ambition, my refusal to grow, my contentment with mediocrity. He compared me to Brittany without even trying to hide it anymore. She understood business, she could hold her own at corporate events, she came from the right family. What did I bring to the table besides home-cooked meals and a grandmother who required constant attention? The argument escalated when I asked directly about the affair. He didn't deny it. Instead, he turned it into another attack on my inadequacy. Of course, he sought companionship elsewhere, when his own wife was more interested in her dying grandmother than her husband's success. When I reminded him of his vows, of his promises, that money didn't matter, he laughed. That was before he realized I'd never be anything more than what I was, a simple woman with no vision for greatness. The word simple had transformed from endearment to insult. His suggestion of couples counseling came 2 weeks later, presented as an olive branch. Dr. Harrison came highly recommended. He said someone who could help us work through our issues. I was desperate enough to believe him, to hope we could salvage something from the wreckage. The first session felt off, with the therapist asking strange questions about my financial contributions to the marriage, about my career goals, about whether I felt I was fulfilling my duties as a wife. It wasn't until later I learned Dr. Harrison was actually Marcus's divorce attorney, and those sessions were recorded depositions. While I was trying to save our marriage, Marcus was systematically destroying it. He moved money from our joint accounts into separate holdings. He encouraged me to sign documents he said were for tax purposes for estate planning for insurance updates. I signed them because despite everything, I still trusted him with the financial aspects of our life. He was right about one thing. I didn't understand the complexities of what he was doing. I didn't realize he was building a case for divorce that would leave me with nothing. Brittany's presence in our home became bolder. She'd stop by to drop off urgent documents that somehow always required wine and lengthy discussions in Marcus's home office. Her perfume would linger in our bedroom, though Marcus claimed she'd never been upstairs. She started leaving things behind: a scarf here, a phone charger there, marking territory like an animal preparing to claim its den. When I confronted Marcus about it, he accused me of being paranoid, suggested maybe I needed individual therapy for my irrational jealousy. Marcus's mother called one evening when he wasn't home, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She wanted me to know that she understood how difficult it must be for me being so out of my depth. She suggested that perhaps it would be better for everyone if I stepped aside gracefully, let Marcus be with someone who could truly complement his lifestyle. She even offered to help me relocate, find a nice apartment back in Queens where I'd be more comfortable. When I told her I wasn't going anywhere, she sighed and said I was just postponing the inevitable, that women like me never kept men like Marcus. The preparation for what was coming became obvious in hindsight. Marcus started documenting my absences, my failure to attend his corporate events, my lack of interest in his business dealings. He had his assistant create a calendar showing all the times I'd chosen my grandmother over his needs. He photographed my simple wardrobe as evidence that I refused to embrace the lifestyle he provided. Every fight we had somehow got recorded, though, only his calm responses, never his provocations. He was building a case that I was an unsuitable wife, a burden who refused to grow into the role required of someone in his position. The divorce ambush happened on a Thursday evening that started like any other. I'd spent the afternoon at the hospital where my grandmother was recovering from her latest surgery, then stopped at the grocery store for ingredients to make Marcus's favorite pasta dish. When I walked into our penthouse at 6:30, arms full of grocery bags, I found Marcus sitting in the living room with two other people. His lawyer, Richard Steinberg, a shark in a three-piece suit, known for decimating wives in divorce proceedings. And Brittany perched on my couch, like she already owned it, wearing the kind of satisfied smile that made my stomach turn to ice. Marcus didn't stand when I entered. He just looked at me with cold eyes and said we needed to have a conversation about our future, or rather the end of it. Richard pulled out a folder thick with documents while Brittany examined her manicured nails, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the light from the chandelier I'd picked out 2 years ago. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed before our wedding was placed on the coffee table like an accusation. Marcus's voice was businesslike as he explained that he was filing for divorce due to irreconcilable differences and my failure to fulfill my duties as a wife befitting someone of his stature. The words that followed blurred together into a humiliating symphony. I was a financial burden who contributed nothing to our household. I had refused to grow into the sophisticated partner he needed for his expanding business empire. I prioritized my grandmother over our marriage. I showed no ambition, no drive, no understanding of the world he inhabited. The litany of my failures went on for 20 minutes while Brittany occasionally murmured supportive sounds and touched Marcus's arm in fake sympathy for what he'd endured being married to someone so beneath him. Richard explained the terms with clinical precision. Thanks to the prenuptial agreement, I was entitled to exactly what I'd brought into the marriage, which was essentially nothing. The apartment was Marcus's before we met. The cars, the bank accounts, the investment portfolios, all his. I would receive a small settlement enough to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on a modest apartment, what Richard called a generous gesture considering I wasn't legally entitled to even that. My personal belongings would be mine to take, though Marcus would need to approve what I claimed as personal versus marital property. When I tried to speak to defend myself to point out 5 years of marriage meant something, Marcus cut me off. He announced that Brittany would be moving in immediately, as she'd already given up her apartment. The transition needed to be smooth for business purposes, as they had important clients coming for dinner that weekend. My presence would only complicate things and send the wrong message about Marcus's future direction. Brittany finally looked directly at me, then her smile widening as she moved closer to Marcus on the couch that had been ours. The eviction was immediate and brutal. Marcus looked at his watch and announced I had 2 hours to pack my personal belongings. Anything I couldn't carry would be donated to charity. Richard would supervise to ensure I didn't take anything that wasn't explicitly mine. I stood frozen in my own home grocery bag, still in my arms, unable to process that this was actually happening. The pasta ingredients for dinner seemed absurd now, domestic normalcy in the face of complete destruction. When I didn't move immediately, Marcus said the clock was ticking and suggested I shouldn't waste time being dramatic. I walked to our bedroom in a daze, finding 3 suitcases already placed on the bed, a clear sign this had been planned down to the smallest detail. As I opened the closet, Brittany appeared in the doorway, already acting like the lady of the house. She offered to help, saying she understood this must be difficult, but it was really for the best. She'd already started moving her things into the other side of the closet, her designer clothes hanging where mine had been just this morning. The casualness of her cruelty was breathtaking. Marcus watched from the doorway as I packed, commenting on various items. The dress he'd bought me for our anniversary that I'd worn, once he decided that should stay since he'd paid for it. The jewelry he'd given me over the years that definitely stayed, as they were technically his property. Even the wedding photos on my nightstand were apparently not mine to take, as he'd paid for the photographer. I packed my pre-marriage clothes, my grandmother's few pieces of jewelry I'd inherited, my books, my personal documents. 5 years of life reduced to 3 suitcases. The security escort to the door was the final humiliation. Marcus had called building security, telling them I was no longer a resident and needed to be escorted out. The doorman who'd greeted me every morning for 5 years couldn't meet my eyes as he walked me to the entrance. Marcus followed, making sure I left the keys, the credit cards, even the gym membership card. Brittany waved from the window as I stood on the sidewalk with my suitcases, her silhouette already comfortable in what had been my home 10 minutes ago. The rain started as if the universe decided to add theatrical emphasis to my devastation. Within minutes, I was soaked, my suitcases heavy with water, my phone battery dying as I tried to call for help. The doorman offered to call me a taxi, pity evident in his voice, but I had only $40 in cash and no idea where I was going. Pride kept me from crying in front of the building where I'd lived as Marcus's wife. Instead, I dragged my suitcases to the subway station, each step taking me further from the life I'd known. Jennifer answered on the first ring, hearing everything in my voice without me saying a word. She gave me her address in Brooklyn, staying on the phone while I navigated the subway with my unwieldy luggage. By the time I reached her apartment, I was shivering, exhausted, and finally able to let the tears fall. She didn't ask questions, just handed me warm clothes and made tea while I sat on her couch, trying to understand how my life had imploded in the span of 2 hours. The humiliation spread through social media with stunning speed. Marcus changed his relationship status to single before I'd even reached Jennifer's apartment. Brittany posted a photo of herself cooking in my kitchen, #newbeginnings. Marcus's friends' wives, who'd pretended to tolerate me, unfriended me within hours. The narrative was already being written without my input. Marcus, the successful businessman, had finally freed himself from his charity case wife, who'd trapped him when he was young and naive. That first night on Jennifer's couch, I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. 5 years of marriage reduced to a 2-hour eviction. The man who'd promised to love me forever had replaced me like updating software, Brittany 2.0 installed seamlessly where I'd been deleted. But as I lay there in the dark, my grandmother's words from before her surgery echoed in my mind. Something about truth, about being more than anyone knew. The brass key she'd given me was still in my wallet, forgotten in the chaos. Tomorrow I decided I would find out what she'd been trying to tell me. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after complete devastation. Jennifer had already left for her hospital shift, leaving me coffee and a note saying to stay as long as I needed. But I had something to do. Something my grandmother had urgently wanted me to know. I took the brass key from my wallet, along with the paper where I'd written the bank name and box number during her medication-hazed rambling. First National Trust on 42nd Street, Box 517. The bank was old-fashioned, all marble and mahogany, the kind that still had human tellers instead of just ATMs. The woman who helped me looked at the key with recognition, checking her computer before leading me to a private room in the vault. The safety deposit box was larger than I expected, and when she left me alone with it, my hands trembled as I inserted the key. Inside were documents that made me sink into the leather chair, my entire understanding of my life shifting like tectonic plates. Henderson Technologies. I knew the name, of course. Everyone in business knew Henderson Technologies, the software company that had revolutionized data management systems 20 years ago. What I didn't know was that my grandmother, Margaret Henderson, was the original investor and silent partner who'd provided the seed money that built the empire. The documents showed everything: her initial investment of her life savings, $200,000 from selling my grandfather's construction company after he died. Her partnership agreement with Thomas Chen, the supposed sole founder. Her quiet accumulation of shares as the company grew. The most shocking document was dated 5 years ago, just before my wedding to Marcus. A transfer of ownership marking my inheritance of my grandmother's 40% stake in Henderson Technologies. 40%. I did the math on my phone, my hands shaking. Henderson Technologies was currently valued at $8 billion. 40% of $8 billion. I had to calculate it 3 times before I believed it. $3.2 billion. I'd been a billionaire for 5 years and never knew it. But there was more. A letter from my grandmother explained everything. She'd hidden the wealth, deliberately wanting me to find love for myself, not my money. She'd watched my mother be courted by fortune hunters before my parents died, seen how money corrupted relationships. So she'd created an elaborate structure. I was listed in all corporate documents as N. Henderson, presumed by everyone to be a reclusive investor. My admin assistant job. I was actually Chief Operations Oversight, a position created to let me monitor the company without anyone knowing who I was. My boss thought I was just an exceptionally talented assistant who somehow always knew what the board was thinking. The final document made me laugh out loud in that empty bank room. My prenuptial agreement with Marcus, the one he'd wielded like a weapon last night, had a clause neither of us had paid attention to. In the event of infidelity leading to divorce, all marital assets would transfer to the wronged party. Marcus had been so confident I had nothing that he'd agreed to it easily. But marital assets included anything acquired during marriage, including business partnerships. Marcus's company had partnered with Henderson Technologies 2 years ago. I technically owned 30% of his company through that partnership. I called Mr. Richardson, the lawyer whose name was on the Henderson Technologies documents. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting for my call for years. His voice was warm but professional as he confirmed what I'd discovered. Yes, I was one of the wealthiest women in New York. Yes, my grandmother had orchestrated everything to protect me while teaching me the value of living simply. Yes, we had significant leverage over Marcus's company through various contracts and partnerships. And yes, he'd been monitoring some concerning irregularities in Marcus's business dealings that I might want to know about. The irregularities were more than concerning, they were criminal. Marcus had been embezzling funds through the partnership, using Henderson Technologies' resources to fund his personal ventures. Brittany's father's company was implicated too, a web of fraud that Mr. Richardson's team had been documenting for months. They'd been waiting for my word to act, respecting my grandmother's wish that I discover the truth in my own time. But now that I knew, now that Marcus had shown his true character, it was time to reveal everything. Mr. Richardson suggested we call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. As the majority shareholder, I could demand it. The other board members, who'd been told N. Henderson was traveling abroad for years, would finally meet me in person. Marcus would arrive at his office to find FBI investigators tipped off about the embezzlement. His assets would be frozen pending investigation. Brittany's father would distance himself immediately to avoid being caught in the scandal. The empire Marcus thought he controlled would crumble in hours. But I wanted to do more than just destroy Marcus professionally. I wanted him to know exactly who he'd thrown away. Mr. Richardson helped me craft the perfect response. We scheduled a press conference for Tuesday, where I'd be announced as the new CEO of Henderson Technologies following a restructuring. The business media would go wild. The story of the secret billionaire who'd lived as a simple admin assistant would dominate headlines. Marcus would learn the truth from the news, just like everyone else. I spent the rest of Friday with Mr. Richardson's team signing documents, reviewing evidence, preparing for Monday's board meeting. They'd apparently been protecting my interests for years on my grandmother's instructions, ensuring my hidden fortune grew while I lived my simple life. The admin assistant salary I'd been living on was a fraction of my daily interest earnings. The irony that Marcus had divorced me for being poor when I could buy his entire company with my pocket change was almost too delicious. Jennifer nearly fainted when I told her that evening. She'd known me for over a decade through college, when I'd worked 3 jobs through years of careful budgeting and modest living. The fact that I'd been secretly wealthy the entire time seemed impossible. But when I showed her the documents, the bank statements, the corporate ownership papers, she started laughing hysterically. Marcus had just made the worst business decision of his life, and he didn't even know it yet. Saturday was for shopping, but not the kind Marcus would have expected. I visited my grandmother, who was recovering beautifully from her surgery now that I could afford the best doctors without worry. She smiled when I told her I'd found the documents, squeezing my hand as she said she was proud of me for living authentically, despite the temptation of wealth. She'd been testing me all these years, and I'd passed by choosing love over money. The fact that the love turned out to be false didn't diminish the value of my choice. I bought a single outfit for Monday's board meeting, a vintage Chanel suit that had belonged to my other grandmother, my father's mother, who'd been a successful businesswoman in her own right. It had been in storage, perfectly preserved, waiting for the right moment. The moment when I would step into my true identity, not as Marcus's discarded wife, but as Naomi Henderson, business mogul and billionaire, the woman Marcus thought was nothing. Sunday night, I sat in Jennifer's apartment reviewing my notes for the board meeting. Somewhere across the city, Marcus was probably in my former home with Brittany, celebrating his freedom from his burden of a wife. He had no idea that his business partners were already being contacted by federal investigators. He had no idea that his company's contracts with Henderson Technologies were about to be voided for breach of ethics clauses. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, his entire world would collapse, and all because he'd thrown away a woman he thought was worthless. Monday morning arrived with the kind of perfect clarity that felt like divine justice. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus walked into his corner office at Steele Enterprises to find 3 FBI agents and 2 SEC investigators waiting with warrants. His assistant, pale and trembling, handed him a termination notice from his own board of directors. The Henderson Technologies emergency board meeting had concluded an hour earlier with unanimous votes to terminate all partnerships with Steele Enterprises and pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. Federal authorities had frozen his personal and business accounts based on evidence of fraud totaling $37 million. The panic in Marcus's voice was audible through the glass walls of his office as he called his lawyer, then his board members, then his mother, each conversation more desperate than the last. Brittany arrived at 10, dressed for her first official day as the future Mrs. Steele, only to be turned away by security. Her designer heels clicked frantically on the marble floor as she tried to call Marcus, but his phone had been confiscated as evidence. The security footage of her being escorted out while screaming about her rights would later go viral on social media. By noon, the news had broken on Bloomberg and CNBC. Steele Enterprises stock plummeted 40% in 2 hours. Major clients pulled their contracts, not wanting to be associated with a fraud investigation. The company Marcus had spent 10 years building hemorrhaged value like a severed artery. His board held an emergency meeting and voted him out, completely installing an interim CEO who immediately announced a full audit and cooperation with federal authorities. The man who'd controlled everything 24 hours ago now controlled nothing. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, called every member of her country club, trying to understand what was happening. How had her son gone from successful businessman to federal investigation subject overnight? The whispers started immediately. Society matrons who'd envied her son's success now delighting in his downfall. The charity board she sat on suddenly found her presence problematic. The social status she'd wielded like a weapon evaporated in hours. Brittany's father, William Brennan, held his own emergency meeting that afternoon. Brennan Investments had been deeply intertwined with Marcus's schemes, though William claimed complete ignorance. Within hours, he'd thrown Marcus completely under the bus, providing investigators with emails and documents that implicated Marcus as the sole architect of the fraud. Brittany was ordered to cut all contact immediately. Her Instagram account, which had been documenting her new life in my former home, went dark. The diamond bracelet she'd flaunted was quietly returned to Cartier. Marcus's attempts to reach me started at 2:37 that afternoon. 37 missed calls by 5 o'clock. Text messages that evolved from angry demands for explanation to desperate pleas for conversation. Voicemails that went from threatening legal action to begging for mercy. His lawyer had finally explained the full scope of what was happening. Henderson Technologies wasn't just a partner, it was the majority controller of his entire business network through various holdings. And N. Henderson, the mysterious investor he'd been trying to court for years, was his discarded wife. The revelation that I was N. Henderson rippled through New York's business community like an earthquake. People who'd dismissed me at corporate events suddenly remembered every interaction differently. The simple wife who'd asked surprisingly insightful questions. The woman who'd seemed to understand complex financial discussions despite claiming ignorance. The quiet presence at charity galas who'd observed everything while saying little. The narrative was rewriting itself in real time. Tuesday's press conference was held at Henderson Technologies headquarters, a building Marcus had visited dozens of times trying to secure meetings with the mysterious N. Henderson. I wore my grandmother's Chanel suit, my hair pulled back, simply no jewelry except my grandmother's pearl earrings. The room was packed with financial journalists, business media tech reporters. When I walked to the podium as the newly revealed CEO and majority owner, the cameras went crazy. My speech was carefully crafted but delivered with genuine emotion. I talked about my grandmother's legacy, her belief that wealth should be earned through character rather than inheritance. I explained my 5 years working undercover in my own company, learning the business from the ground up. I announced the new Henderson Foundation, funded with $50 million, focused on supporting women entrepreneurs who'd been underestimated by traditional business structures. I never mentioned Marcus by name, but everyone knew exactly who I was talking about when I said some people could only see value in designer labels and bank statements. The questions from reporters were brutal and delicious. Was it true I'd been married to Marcus Steele? Yes, though that was no longer the case. Did I know about his fraudulent activities? My lawyers had discovered irregularities that were immediately reported to appropriate authorities. Would Henderson Technologies pursue damages? We would seek full restitution for stolen funds and breach of contract. The Bloomberg reporter asked if I had any comment about my ex-husband's current situation. I smiled and said I wished him all the growth opportunities that come from starting over with nothing. Marcus watched the press conference from his lawyer's office, the only place he could go since the penthouse had been seized as a potentially fraudulently purchased asset. According to Richard, who heard from Marcus's lawyer, Marcus went completely white when I walked to that podium. The woman he'd thrown out like garbage was announcing a net worth that dwarfed his even at his peak. The simple wife who couldn't understand business was being praised as a visionary CEO. The burden he'd discarded was now the reason his entire life had collapsed. The social media explosion was instant and merciless. My story went viral with hashtags like #BillionaireBossRevenge and #NaomiKnowsBest. Someone leaked security footage of me being escorted out of the penthouse with my suitcases, which played split screen with footage of me at the press conference. The contrast was devastating. Marcus's Facebook page, where he'd announced our divorce just days ago, was flooded with comments calling him the worst businessman in history. Brittany's carefully curated Instagram became a monument to her failed gold digging. The international business community took notice immediately. Interview requests poured in from Fortune, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal. Tech conferences wanted me as a keynote speaker. Investment firms that had ignored Henderson Technologies for years suddenly wanted meetings. The company's stock value increased 18% in 2 days, just on the news of my taking public control. Every success was another nail in the coffin of Marcus's reputation. By Thursday, Marcus's complete destruction was finished. Criminal charges were formally filed, 23 counts of embezzlement fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. His assets remained frozen pending trial. His business was dissolved, purchased for pennies on the dollar by a competitor who immediately fired all of Marcus's loyalists. His country club revoked his membership. His Harvard Business School Alumni Association distanced themselves. The man who'd measured worth in social standing and bank accounts had neither. Brittany turned state's witness to avoid prosecution, revealing details about Marcus's schemes that even investigators hadn't discovered. She testified that he'd been planning to divorce me for over a year, systematically hiding assets and building a case against me. She provided emails where he'd called me pathetic, useless dead weight. The same emails revealed his plans to pursue N. Henderson after ditching me, trying to seduce the mysterious billionaire he had no idea was his own wife. The irony was so perfect, it felt like fiction. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, showed up at Henderson Technologies on Friday, demanding to see me. Security called to ask what I wanted to do. I had her escorted to my top-floor office, letting her wait 45 minutes in the reception area, where she could see my name on every award, every magazine cover framed on the walls. When I finally had her shown in, she looked older, smaller, diminished. The woman who'd tormented me for 5 years could barely make eye contact. Her plea was pathetic. She begged me to show mercy, to remember the good times, to consider that Marcus had loved me once. She offered to apologize for every cruel thing she'd said if I would just drop the charges, unfreeze his accounts, give him another chance. When I reminded her that she'd called me temporary, that she'd said women like me never kept men like Marcus, she actually cried. I told her she was right. Women like me didn't keep men like Marcus. We outgrew them. Security escorted her out while she sobbed about family and forgiveness. The months following Marcus's spectacular downfall became a masterclass in building something beautiful from destruction's ashes. I moved into my grandmother's estate in Westchester, a sprawling property I'd never known existed, complete with gardens, a library, and views of the Hudson River. She'd been living modestly by choice while owning this magnificent home, teaching me through example that wealth meant nothing without wisdom. Now, recovered from her surgery and cancer-free, she moved into the guest house, finally accepting comfort in her 80s that she'd denied herself for decades. Henderson Technologies thrived under my public leadership. The employees who'd known me as an admin assistant adjusted quickly when they learned I'd been observing and learning all along. My first executive decision was implementing profit sharing that extended to every level of the company, from janitors to engineers. The second was establishing on-site childcare and flexible working arrangements. The third was creating a mentorship program for women in tech, funded by the millions we recovered from Marcus's embezzlement. The legal proceedings against Marcus moved forward with devastating efficiency. His trial date was set for 6 months out, but his lawyer was already discussing plea deals. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Brittany's testimony alone would have been enough, but combined with the financial records, the email trails, the documented fraud, Marcus was looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. His attempts to negotiate were met with silence. I had no interest in showing mercy to someone who'd shown me none. My days took on a rhythm of purpose I'd never experienced before. Morning meetings with department heads who respected my insights. Lunch with potential partners who saw Henderson Technologies as the future of ethical business. Afternoons developing new initiatives, reviewing proposals, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers. Evenings with my grandmother, cooking together in the kitchen, while she told stories about my parents I'd never heard, about the family legacy I was now carrying forward. Jennifer remained my closest friend, but our dynamic shifted as my new reality settled in. I hired her as my personal assistant, tripling her nurse's salary and providing health benefits that covered her entire family. She managed my calendar, coordinated my charitable giving, and most importantly, kept me grounded. When wealthy suitors started appearing, men who suddenly found me fascinating, now that my bank account had been revealed, Jennifer was the one who reminded me what genuine connection looked like. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Marcus at a federal courthouse where he was attending a pretrial hearing. He was thin, gray-faced, wearing a suit that looked borrowed. His mother sat behind him, aged a decade in half a year. When he saw me walking past in a simple but elegant dress with my legal team, something broke in his eyes. He tried to approach, but his lawyer held him back. I heard him say my name not with anger or pleading, but with the kind of regret that comes from finally understanding the magnitude of a mistake. The news covered his plea deal extensively. 12 years in minimum security prison, forfeiture of all assets, lifetime ban from serving as an officer of any public company. Marcus Steele, who'd once commanded boardrooms and influenced millions in deals, would spend the next decade in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. His mother sold her jewelry, her cars, her country club membership to pay for his legal fees. The society queens who'd once envied her now whispered about her at charity functions she could no longer afford to attend. Brittany disappeared from New York entirely. Last anyone heard, she was working as a real estate agent in Phoenix. Her social media presence completely scrubbed her dreams of marrying into wealth destroyed by her own greed and betrayal. Her father's company survived, but diminished forever, tainted by association with the scandal. The Brennan name, once gold in investment circles, became synonymous with poor judgment and ethical failure. A year after that horrible Thursday when Marcus threw me out, I stood in the same penthouse apartment, now mine through the asset forfeiture settlement. The space looked exactly as it had. Brittany hadn't had time to redecorate before everything collapsed. But I didn't want it this monument to a failed marriage and false life. Instead, I donated it to a charity that housed women escaping domestic abuse, women who'd been told they were nothing by men who should have treasured them. Daniel came into my life slowly, carefully, like dawn breaking after the longest night. An architect who'd designed Henderson Technologies' new campus expansion, he knew my story, everyone did, but treated me like Naomi, not like a billionaire or a revenge success story. Our first conversation was about sustainable building materials. Our first coffee wasn't a date, just a continuation of a fascinating discussion about environmental responsibility in corporate construction. He drove a 10-year-old Toyota and lived in a modest apartment in Astoria. When he learned about my wealth, his first question was whether I ever missed the simplicity of my old life. We took things slowly, both of us carrying our own bruises from past relationships. Daniel had been engaged to his college girlfriend, who'd left him for someone more ambitious, more willing to compromise ethics for profit. He understood what it felt like to be deemed insufficient by someone who claimed to love you. Our connection built on shared values. Rather than grand gestures, quiet dinners at neighborhood restaurants. Rather than exclusive venues, walks in Central Park. Rather than helicopter rides to the Hamptons. Marcus's letters from prison started arriving after 18 months. I read the first one, a rambling mixture of apology and self-pity, blaming everyone but himself while simultaneously begging for forgiveness. The second one I returned unopened. By the fifth, I instructed my lawyers to send a cease and desist order. He needed to live with his choices, just as I was living with mine. The difference was my choices led to freedom, while his led to a federal cell. My grandmother passed peacefully in her sleep 2 years after the divorce, having lived just long enough to see me fully embrace my heritage and use it wisely. Her funeral was small, intimate, just as she would have wanted. But the impact of her life rippled through the business world as stories emerged about the woman who'd quietly built an empire while teaching her granddaughter that character mattered more than cash. The Henderson Foundation, renamed the Margaret Henderson Foundation in her honor, became one of the most influential forces in supporting women entrepreneurs. Marcus served 8 years of his 12-year sentence, released early for good behavior. He emerged to find a world that had moved on completely without him. His former colleagues wouldn't return his calls. His country club friends pretended not to know him. He took a job selling insurance in New Jersey, living in a one-bedroom apartment, taking the bus to work. The exact life he'd mocked me for living, except his was necessity, not choice. I married Daniel 3 years after we met in a ceremony in my grandmother's garden with just 20 guests. No prenuptial agreement, no hidden assets, no tests or games. Just two people who'd learned the hard way that love meant seeing someone's true worth beyond their net worth. Jennifer was my maid of honor, crying through her entire speech about friendship and loyalty, and knowing someone's value when the world insisted they had none. The wedding photos captured something Marcus's expensive photographer never had: genuine joy. Daniel looking at me like I was his entire universe, not because of my billions, but despite them. Me laughing freely, not the careful, controlled smile of a woman trying to fit into a world that didn't want her, but the authentic happiness of someone who'd found her place by creating it herself. 5 years after that devastating Thursday night, I received word that Marcus had requested a meeting through his lawyer. Curiosity made me agree. We met in a neutral location, a coffee shop in Midtown Security, discreetly present. The man across from me bore little resemblance to the golden boy who deemed me worthless. Prison and poverty had humbled him in ways I couldn't have imagined. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness or another chance. He simply wanted to tell me that he finally understood. He'd thrown away the only real thing in his life, chasing an illusion of success. He'd measured worth in all the wrong currencies. When he asked if I was happy, I told him yes without hesitation. Happy with Daniel, who supported my work while pursuing his own dreams. Happy with the 2 children we were raising to understand that money was a tool, not a measure of human value. Happy with the company that thrived under ethical leadership. Happy with the life I'd built from the ashes of the one he'd burned down. He nodded, paid for his coffee with crumpled bills, and walked away. I never saw him again. The truth about wealth, I learned, isn't about having it or not having it. It's about understanding that money amplifies who you already are. Marcus had money, and it amplified his greed, his shallowness, his cruelty. I had money hidden and then revealed, and it amplified my grandmother's lessons about generosity, wisdom, and authentic living. The 3 days between Marcus throwing me out and his world collapsing weren't just about revenge or karma or poetic justice. They were about truth finally breaking through the lies we tell ourselves about what makes someone valuable. Marcus thought he was throwing away trash that Thursday night. He'd convinced himself that a woman without wealth, without connections, without the right clothes or the right family was worthless. He measured my value in dollars and found me lacking. But worth isn't in a bank account or a designer dress or a prestigious address. Worth is in the dignity with which you treat others, the integrity with which you live your life, the love with which you face the world, even when it's cruel. Standing in my office now, looking out over the city where I was once discarded like garbage, I think about that night sometimes. Not with bitterness or anger, but with an odd gratitude. Marcus's cruelty freed me from a life of pretense, from a marriage built on lies, from a future of diminishing myself to soothe someone else's ego. His rejection became my liberation. His worst decision became my best opportunity. My grandmother was right about keeping the money secret. It allowed me to see who people really were when they thought I had nothing to offer but myself. Most failed that test spectacularly. But some, like Jennifer, like Daniel, passed it by seeing value that had nothing to do with net worth. Those are the people who matter, the ones who love you when you're nobody, who stand by you when you have nothing, who see your worth when the world insists you're worthless. The business journals call me a success story, but they miss the real triumph. It's not that I went from nothing to billions because I had those billions all along. It's that I went from believing I needed someone else's validation to knowing my own worth. Marcus broke my heart, but not my spirit. He took my home, but not my hope. He stole 5 years, but gave me the rest of my life, free from the prison of his judgment. If Marcus ever reads this story, which I doubt since federal prisons limit internet access, I want him to know something. I don't hate him. Hate would mean he still has power over my emotions, and he doesn't. I nothing him, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare. He exists in my past like a lesson learned, a mistake that taught me wisdom, a storm that revealed my strength. He was so worried about me being poor that he never realized he was the one living in poverty, a poverty of character that no amount of money could cure. To anyone watching who's been told they're not enough, who's been measured by someone else's shallow standards and found lacking, who's been discarded by someone who should have treasured them, remember this: your worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. Sometimes the person telling you you're nothing is standing in front of your everything. Sometimes rejection is redirection towards something better. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that could have happened for you. What would you do if someone you loved told you that you were worthless? Would you believe them, or would you know better? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known your value? Share your story in the comments below, because every story of overcoming deserves to be heard. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about triumph over betrayal. Share this video with anyone who needs to remember their worth isn't determined by someone else's blindness. Thank you for watching, and remember, the only person who can determine your value is you. Stay strong, stay true, and never let anyone convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary.